Over the past year, I acquired a Kicker direct drive smart trainer, which was my first foray into riding with power. A big shift from training solely based on RPE and or heart rate, but it's been limited to indoor rides since, of course, it is a trainer. More recently, I began riding with Asioma. Those are made by Favero, but Favero Asioma Duo power pedals, and have enjoyed the challenge of structured power-based workouts outside with your outside workouts. One issue I've encountered right away is my inability to put out consistent power on downhills. This wasn't a big surprise since I have traditionally struggled to keep up with others on downhills, but I've always chalked it up as a general disadvantage of being a smaller rider rather than a skill that could be acquired if I worked on it. For reference, I'm 5 foot 4 inches and about 55 kilograms, so this is a small athlete, right? So my question is, what can I do to improve my power output and consistency when riding on variable terrain outdoors, but specifically on downhills? Thanks again. I appreciate any tips, tricks, or advice. So there's physics we can't get around, right? Like, they just exist. And the fact is, if you're a bigger rider, you have more mass, it's going down at an angle, and it's going to carry more energy and hold on to that energy for a little bit longer as well when you get down to the flats. It's just how it works. Like, if Pete and I tuck at the top of a hill, I am never going to be faster than Pete, right? That's just the way science works. So there's one side of things where you can look at this, and we are going to get into like actionable ways that you can improve in this regard. But I think probably the most effective way to look at this is to look at it in terms of you have a certain amount of kilojoules you can expend over that race. And it would be a shame to really put in a lot of effort expending kilojoules in a spot where science dictates you just will be at a disadvantage. And you kind of want to look at it as, I want to be able to expend kilojoules where I can have the most advantage, where I can actually play things into my favor and I can get the biggest differential on the field, something like that. So I understand that, you want to improve in this regard, and the chances are there's ways that you can, but this is a great example of many times picking out like a limiter, but it's something that you actually can't really budge in terms of the rules of science. You can't ever make yourself something you're not. So I guess with that qualifying thing in there, what would you say, Pete, on being able to hold steady power on descents? Because that's kind of a different thing than just outright speed, right?
Yeah, there's kind of like that high RPM, high power, high speed stuff is really difficult for a lot of people, and you just don't spend that much time doing it. So of course it's going to feel foreign, and it's something you can practice just like everything else. And actually on a kicker, you can shift into a big high gear and kind of get some feeling like that. And it'll help, but definitely doing it outside and practicing putting power on the downhill and kind of steady power, just like you say, where it's real easy to surge up and surge down because you're at those high RPMs and you're at high power. So it's just practice, just like everything else. But at the same time, that's not the most advantageous way to expend your kilojoules on a downhill. So even though that is good to practice, I wouldn't put that as your go-to descent power output. Especially for a smaller rider, you want to get as much speed as quickly as you can. So you're going to put out a lot of power at the top and then hopefully catch on. Or, even like if John pedals as hard as he can over the top, gets in my draft, I'm still going to drop John on most downhills. It doesn't matter how much power he puts out. So thinking about if John could actually get in front of me by 5 seconds on the top of the descent, and then I come past him, he's going to be closer to me by the time we get to the bottom, which is actually less work overall for John than the consistent power and getting dropped from my draft. So there's a lot of times where 5 or 10 or 20 seconds of extra power for a smaller rider over the top and to get up to speed faster than the bigger rider is going to make you closer overall at the bottom of the hill. So it's good to practice the consistent power, but start figuring out a way to really pop over the top and get up to speed faster than everybody else, and hopefully actually have a gap on the bigger riders, because they'll catch up and they'll pass you, but you'll be closer overall. So it's kind of two things you have to practice, I guess.
Yeah. Chad, do you have anything to add on this one?
Yeah. And I'm just going to view it from a training maximization perspective. So relative to your workouts, we're not talking race strategy here or hanging in there with riders who fall down the hill faster than you do, rather trying to make your workouts what they're supposed to be. it's one of two things. You either have to find suitable terrain. So look at your workout, look at where you plan to ride. If you can't replicate the demands of that workout on that course, don't use that course. Stay inside. That's the other alternative. Anytime a workout has to be a particular thing and you can't make it happen outdoors, don't go outdoors. Stay inside. I know it's a bummer. Sometimes you just want to do these rides outside, but some workouts are better suited to the indoors.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. And you can't break that. And like Pete said, in those situations, if you're really training for it, then you really want to train in the gear that you'll be using, right? So tiny cog, big chain ring, and that's what you hold on to. And it really comes down to inertia in that case. And when you have more inertia, it basically changes where you dole out force and torque throughout that pedal stroke when you're pedaling on the bike. Now, this doesn't mean that this justifies any sort of, deep dive into your pedal stroke analysis and trying to improve it in that regard. I guarantee you'll do a really bad job at that. It's always funny if you're ever pedaling and then if you've ever pedaled with something that's graphing your torque and everything else, and you can try to do things, but it never actually ends up in the result that you think. We're not perfect machines. So I'm not talking about that. Instead, what I'm talking about is just familiarizing yourself with pedaling with high inertia. Like Pete said, it takes time to get used to it, and it's tough. And if you aren't used to it, it's going to be harder. But once again, strengths, weaknesses, and limiters. 3 different things, right? Your strengths are your strengths, understand them, and know when to use them. Your weaknesses and limiters are differentiated by what actually holds you back from performing as you should on race day. That's a limiter versus a weakness. And there are plenty of ways that you can work around that, and you can work around your weaknesses, and you can smooth out those limiters. And that concept of accelerating first and getting up to speed is extremely important. And then finally, get aero. This is that's one thing that I've really focused on, because I race with a lot of bigger athletes, it seems like, compared to me. And against an athlete like Pete, that's one of the only things I can do. And actually, if you go onto our YouTube channel, it's called the UNR criterium. It was a college campus criterium that Pete and I did, I think, last year. And when we were doing that, Pete and I were able to roll away from people on a descent. And I think the reason that we were able to roll away from it is Pete is relatively very aerodynamic for his size. It's many times size and aerodynamics don't actually work out very well just because you cut a bigger hole. But Pete is aerodynamic for his size, weighs a lot. And then I think I'm really aerodynamic, but it's just, I have no data to back that up. But as a result, Pete, you and I were able to roll away from the field on that descent repeatedly, and that was helpful. But I had to accelerate beforehand and put in a dig at the top in order to not get passed by you or in order to not lose your wheel. So really good tip.
Mm-hmm.